everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Family by Design. Today, Liz and I are going to talk about safeguarding your marriage. Maybe not something you thought about before, but a really, really important thing. When you get married, you need to make sure your marriage is protected. So many marriages today in the world and in the church are failing, and I believe that you can safeguard your marriage from doing that. So take out your pen and paper, open up your heart, and allow the Lord to minister to you as you hear Liz and I talk about safeguarding your marriage. Okay, so here's a question that I want to ask you, and I feel like you're going to have good answers. And the reason I feel like that is because we already set it up for me to ask you this question because you have good answers, all right? So here's a question is, how do you safeguard your marriage? And I think that's maybe not a question we would ask, but everybody wants their marriage. I mean, we go into marriage wanting it to be good. And oftentimes people's marriages end up not good. They either live in hell or they get divorced or something. And so how do you safeguard your marriage? Now, there could be a lot in that. And so let me be a little bit more direct.
Sure.
How do you safeguard your marriage from things being infiltrated into it that shouldn't be there? And there's probably quite a bit we could add into that. But
Right.
Just in general, answer that question for us.
Well, I think first off, you have to be willing to be transparent and honest with yourself, but then be willing to be honest with your spouse, and then make your life completely open and available to them so that there isn't any area that they can't come and ask you a question or question you, not like in a bad like questioning way, but like, can your spouse come to you and ask you, are you safe here? Can I look at your phone here? That's a huge thing. Can I have access to your phone whenever I want at any moment?
Yeah.
And see what you're watching? Do I have permission to do that? And if the answer is yes, awesome. But if the answer is no, then the question is, obviously you don't want somebody to come in and like control you. You can't watch this, you can't do this. But I mean like in the sense of like, are you putting things before your eyes that you shouldn't be putting before your eyes? Like, are you struggling in an area maybe that I was unaware that you're struggling? Like, can we be really honest and open about things that are happening with us without it being like this crazy, awful place where it causes division? Because when you're completely open and honest and vulnerable, the good, the bad, the ugly, we're going to be married when we set our vows through good times and in bad times, when we're going through things and when things are awesome, but like we're going through it together. And so I think being open and honest and conversation, being protective in the sense of not like wanting to control, but willing to understand, especially like for men in pornography or for men in their eyes of looking at other things. Like, can I see your phone? Like, can I know what it is that you're watching? Like, how can I help you here, not shame you?
Yeah. And it's interesting is that, so you're kind of describing accountability is largely what you're describing. Right. And accountability is, it's not really I'm not even aware of a scripture that says to be like, you're supposed to be accountable, like what we're talking about. But it definitely is a concept that's in the scriptures. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And so, right. There's other verses too, but there's a place for us leaning on each other, but that only goes as far as what people are willing to release.
Right.
And so a question I think to ask in this is that is your marriage vulnerable? Are you vulnerable? Is your spouse vulnerable? Can you guys talk about deep things? Can you talk about problems that you have had and problems that you're currently having? Can you do that? Because if you can't have safe conversation, then you have your closest person to you. There's nobody closer to you than your spouse.
Right.
It's the most vulnerable relationship that you have. Definitely physically, it should be anyways. You should be, practicing your covenant.
Right.
So in that sense, it's the most vulnerable thing. But are you emotionally and communicatively in your communication? Yeah. Are you vulnerable with them? And if you can't be or you're not, something is wrong there. Because the person that's closest to us, we should be able to trust at the highest level.
Right.
And I think that marriages should have a built-in accountability system. And accountability, like, especially back in the day, that was real heavy in the church.
Right.
Like, oh, I need an accountability partner. And it's like, okay, you're my accountability partner. I've been really struggling with my eyes, or been struggling with my eating or something, and I need you to keep me accountable. And it's like, okay, brother, I'll keep you accountable. And you come back a week later, it's like, how you doing with that whole pornography thing? It's like, well, I did stumble one time. Well, I'm just kidding. Actually, it was 2 times. But I'm glad I could tell you about it. And it's like, oh, okay. Yeah. Glad you told me about it too. And it's like, what is that? What is that? It's not helpful. So accountability isn't about checking up on each other every 4 days. It's about being able to go to somebody else and saying, help me get through this and get past it.
Right.
It's not coming and just talking about your downfalls and your faults or whatever.
Right.
Hopefully that makes sense. But the accountability stuff that I experienced when I was mostly as a teenager,
right.
In church I went to, like, the idea was cool, but nobody really knew what to do with it. And so the whole concept is a little bit ambiguous as far as what it actually looks like, how you actually go about it. But when you're talking about in a marriage, you should be able to tell your spouse, if it's a man, I'm struggling with pornography, or I'm struggling to keep my eyes right. Like, I mean, if that's going on, you need to get help. You might need to get help outside of your marriage,
right.
Just depending on the severity and what's happening. But that marriage, it needs to be able to be at a place of being that vulnerable. The wife, there's women that struggle with pornography too. It's not exclusive men. It's just way, way more men than it is women. But the wife, she could be struggling with just feeling like, I feel like you're going to leave me, or I feel like, you're going to abandon me, or I feel like, I'm mad at this, that, or the other. I don't like, whatever it is, there has to be a place of vulnerability,
right,
where you can talk to one another. And in that, accountability is built in.
right.
You can't have accountability without vulnerability.
Right.
It's impossible. Because you can say, let's be accountable to each other. Hey, how are you doing? And you told me you're struggling. Well, I'm doing great.
Right.
And all the while you're still struggling. Why? Because you're not willing to be vulnerable. Or at least you're saying you're not struggling, even if you are, because you're not willing to be vulnerable.
Right.
But the vulnerability brings a level of natural built-in accountability to where it's like, okay, I've already committed that I'm going to be vulnerable with my spouse. That means I'm going to have to tell them, I don't want to go there. That's kind of an immature level. A base level is probably a better word of dealing with problems, but it can be a starting place.
Right.
We should be so strong in the Lord that we're concerned about the fact that that He is seeing what we're doing. Right. Because the Lord sees everything.
That's right.
Now, He's not condemning us, but there should be a reverence and a fear of the Lord that we say, Lord, I'm going to hide this word in my heart that I won't sin against you. Yeah. Because so oftentimes we're concerned about if other people, like if someone's sneaking porn, or if you have somebody that is has an eating problem and the Lord's dealt with them, and they're going and they don't want other people to know, and they're going in and they're sneaking ding dongs at midnight or something like that. Well, no one else might see what you're doing, but the Lord does. And so if you fear whether other people will see you or not, but you don't fear that the Lord would see you, you have a fear of man and not a fear of God.
Yeah.
And so the fear of the Lord needs to enter back in.
That's right.
But with that being said, we work through things together a lot. And not just about, we're talking about the bad, real bad things, but just whatever it is, there needs to be vulnerability there in the marriage.
Right.
Any kind of communication, anything. So throwing it back to you, those are some of my thoughts about how to safeguard your marriage, is being able to really be vulnerable.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is key. And so if you can't be vulnerable, you have to start somewhere. And sometimes it can look a little messy because you're like, because here's the thing, is that we'll get offended at what our spouse's perspective or their thoughts, or it feels like they're coming at us.
I'm sorry I got offended.
And so then if we're
I felt targeted because that's true. That's true. I've been that way before.
yeah, but we've
I
had,
repented.
yeah, we've had to work through that. But then, sometimes our spouse doesn't want to have to hear what we're going to say. Sometimes they don't want to have to deal with our emotions. Sometimes they think we're too emotional. And, so there's all this balance. So I think it's healthy to, be honest with yourself, but then be able to, process with your spouse through different things. Like, we're human vessels. Everybody has things that they're dealing with, perspectives that are not right, emotions that are not in check. Like we need these we call them safe places, safe spaces, and it should be most importantly with our spouse that we can come to them and there not be offense and, broken unity and all that, and we can just say what it is that we need to say and then work through things together.
Yeah.
So if you can't do that, then this is where, I would say you need to have like a third party person that you can have help figuring out how to be vulnerable with each other and not be attacking. Because oftentimes, because we are offended, because we're hurt, because we're wounded, because we're walking in unforgiveness and we don't know it and we are holding on.
Pride too.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw that in there.
All this baggage and stuff, like we don't want to go to these places with our spouse. First, we might not think there's anything wrong with us. We might not think that this is important. We might think, well, everything is fine. Like there's the status quo, but like even to grow in intimacy, especially with our spouse, like it takes like a greater vulnerability to be able to a greater exposure, a greater peeling back of things to like get to this really raw place.
I think the thing is really the reason we don't get vulnerable is because we self-preserve.
Yeah.
And I wrote about this in my book, Breaking Vagabond. I talked about that, self-preservation is a freedom blocker.
Yeah, it is.
So the whole, I think it's chapter 6 in there, is titled The Freedom Blocker. And it is the thing being, what's the word I just used? Self-preservation is the thing that blocks freedom in your life. Because God doesn't work in darkness, he works in the light.
That's right.
So as soon as you're willing to say, okay, I'm not going to try to preserve myself here, and I'm going to step in to the light and allow God to help me in this, allow the Holy Spirit to really pinpoint and begin to bring healing and freedom to me, until you're willing to do that, you'll never find it. Sometimes that vulnerability needs to happen with your spouse. Sometimes it could just be as simple as like, I had a wrong thought there. Like, you don't need to go and disclose every single thing that a wrong emotion, wrong thought, or you can go overboard with this.
Sure, yeah.
But there are some things you definitely need to bring to your spouse and say, hey, if you have a sin or a hang up, a pattern you've been in, you need to go to your spouse and say, I need help. If you're just dealing with like, oh, that was a wrong thing, you could just take it to the Lord and say, Lord, forgive me. That was wrong for me to think that, to act that way, whatever. You don't have to go overboard. But for whatever way or, you're not willing, or level you're not willing to be vulnerable, and you try to self-preserve, like, oh my gosh, I can't let anybody in and see any of this darkness or any of these thoughts or, whatever. If you do that, you're ultimately keeping yourself in bondage, because God doesn't work in darkness. He only works in the light. So what happens is when we try to cover ourselves, we keep ourselves in darkness.
Right. But
when we bring ourselves to the light, God covers us. And when God covers us, he protects us, he hides us, but he also sets us free.
That's right.
Those are attributes that we do not possess. Only he possesses that. Right. So when we stay, and the thing is, God sees everything anyways. So why would you be unauthentic with the Lord? It's just not even smart. Then with people, I can understand the level of feeling like you need to self-preserve with people, because there are some people that'll spit you up and chew you out.
Yeah.
If your spouse is one of them, you have bigger problems than not being vulnerable. You have a non-honor and a non-care factor and a really a misunderstanding about the roles of a husband and a wife.
Right.
And so because when your spouse comes to you and says, baby, I need to talk to you about something, and it's going to be difficult or whatever, and it might be a difficult conversation, but you should both have the confidence that the other one is going to cover you, not expose you, not embarrass you, not bring shame to you. And if you don't have that confidence, then how can you move forward in conversation with them? You can't. So vulnerability needs to be there, but there also has to be a track record of, this is a safe place for you to have communication with me.
Right.
You can talk to me. I'm not going to go run and tell everybody else. But one of the things we've found, and we've seen this from in many places, in many ways, in many couples over the years, is that one will run and say, help, 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 help. And the other one is unwilling to help. And because they're unwilling to help, the other one feels the need to reach out for help. And in those cases, I don't know what else you do if one is completely unwilling to go there and get the help and get to that place to where they'll allow the Lord to move in that area. I don't know what else you do. Sometimes you have to step outside for help, but you better make sure you're covering your spouse in the midst of it.
That's right.
You better not be exposing your spouse's weaknesses.
That's right.
Because that brings shame and it only adds more to the problem.
That's right. Right. And I think, in that sense, I think you have to begin to journey with the Lord and start getting vulnerable and transparent with the Lord.
Start with Him. Yeah.
And allow Him to cover you and protect you, and learn how to not be in self-preservation even in that relationship with the Lord. And as you grow there, it becomes easier with every other relationship.
That's right.
And then it makes it so much easier, because you want to be able to grow in intimacy and grow in relationship with your spouse, especially. I mean, that is the number one. It should be the best relationship. It should be the most open, the most vulnerable place. It should be the safest place, but oftentimes it's not. And so if it's not for you, I want to encourage you that you have that with the Lord, and that you can process and you can come to healing and get out of self-preservation and shame and guilt and condemnation with the Lord. The Lord is always, to me, actually the safest place and the best place to process and come to some great revelation and freedom.
Yeah.
And if you can do it in that relationship, it's not that you can't do it. You will be able to do it in every other relationships, but it won't be like a life or death thing if it's not happening with your spouse. That actually what happens is the compassion of the Lord begins to fill you at greater levels for them.
Yeah.
And then you're able to see and pray for them at greater lengths and love them at greater capacity, because you can see where the enemy has come in and lied to them. And instead of that being something that drives a wedge between you, it actually makes you be drawn to them. And it's because you're hidden and found in the Lord. He's your security, and everything you need comes from the Lord. Your source is the Lord, because if we're not careful, even in this conversation, you should have relationship with your spouse. It should be the greatest relationship on this earth that you have.
That's right.
But the Lord is your number one. And if we're not careful, we can get dependent upon these other relationships and not dependent solely on the Lord. So we should be dependent completely on the Lord, and every other relationship we should be interdependent.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll just strike while the iron's hot here with this particular thing, and then we're about out of time. But we just recently heard of there's a major scandal that took place in the body of Christ with a minister who has been very loved by a lot of people, and even known to be very devoted to the Word, very devoted to prayer, very devoted to ministry, and as far as everybody could tell, very devoted to his family.
Yeah.
And then this thing came out that he had been having, sexual relationship with many, many other women over a period of years. And I don't know the details. It's not really my business, but most people are aware of it now. And those things have happened a lot over the years. And so I think for anybody to say, oh, I could never fall, that could never happen to
Right.
me, I think you're fooling yourself. And so then, but how do you guarantee that you don't do that? Ultimately, it all comes back to the level of thinking, like what they're thinking about, what they're meditating on, because you could spend a bunch of hours reading the scriptures, but still not really have your focus on the Lord. You
Right.
can do that.
Yeah.
We've probably all done that
Yeah,
at some point.
for
We've
sure.
read and we're thinking about, may not be something bad, but we're thinking about something else.
Right.
And so, but then my first question when I heard about this particular scandal, my very first thing I said to you was, how does somebody have affairs like that? Like, first of all, on a level of like actually doing that, you could ask how. But then I wasn't even asking that because I understand that because I understand sin. I'm a
Right.
man. I understand sin, and I understand that sin.
Right.
Every man understands that sin. I've never come even anywhere close to that line at all, but I understand how a man could fall into that if they allowed themselves to continue going down that road long enough
Sure.
and far enough. But I don't understand logistically how somebody could do that. Like, because for me, now when I worked in my own business, you didn't know where I was every second of every day because I was driving all around the city doing
And cell
installations.
phones weren't like they were now.
And so, but now, how? I don't even know how I would do that. Not that I've thought about doing that, but how? And so that made me think about something.
Yeah.
We have a pretty tight rope on each other. And I think that there's some things that we could do to even have a tighter one to where...
Not controlling.
No, not controlling. We just know what's going on.
Right.
We always know what's going on. We know where each other are. We know who we're talking to. We know what we're looking at on our devices. All that stuff. That should be open. If you have a passcode on your device where your wife or your husband can't get into your phone, you got something wrong there. Something's wrong there. If you don't want other people to have your device passcode, that's fine. But your spouse definitely should be able to get in your
And
phone.
you should have your children's.
And you definitely should have your children's. You should be able to look at what's going on their phone. So, anyways, throwing out a lot there.
Yeah.
But I heard Andrew Womack say this one time, and it was so good. He said, and this was, and I'm sure it's true today, this was many years ago. He said, it's impossible for me to have an affair. He said, I could not go commit adultery right now. And he said, people think that I'm saying, oh, that it couldn't happen to me. He said, no, I'm not saying that. He just said, I'm so pressed into the Lord right now. He said, I'm so going after the Lord. He said, you can't make a U-turn at 100 miles an hour. He said, you got to slow down before you do that. And he said, so if people will just stay pressed into the Lord, looking only into the Lord, when an opportunity comes, that opportunity is passed quickly, and they can't just take it.
Right.
And the point he was saying is that if you're really pressed into the Lord and you're really looking to the Lord, you're not going to be entertaining those other things.
Right.
If your mind and your heart is set on the Lord, you're not going to entertain those other things. But then another layer of safeguard, whatever those things are for you, another layer of safeguard is have your spouse involved with everything. And I mean, that doesn't mean that we go and we're like looking at each other's phones, but I leave my phone laying around, you leave your phone laying around, we pick our phones up, each other's phones up at any time.
And ask questions.
Yeah. Whatever, anything. Yeah. So we need to have that vulnerability, need to have the trust to go along with it, and come out from self-preservation and make ourselves at a place with our spouses to where we can get free, walk free, and stay free. And safeguard our marriage. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Family by Design. I pray that you were blessed as you listen to the word of the Lord for your life today. I want to encourage you to go on and leave us a review and a 5-star rating. If this ministry is blessing you, go to our website at www.wartmen.org. There you can find more resources, and you can also consider partnering with this ministry. If you like what we're doing, we just pray that you would at least join us in prayer and consider supporting us financially as we take the gospel deep into the hearts of people. Gospel preached, hearts awakened, and nations reformed.